I have to say I was slightly surprised because I thought that there would be a diplomatic movement of the 2 weeks which Trump had given the Iranians, to which they would then um, be given the golden bridge over which they could retreat for the future with dignity and honor in terms of Persian cultural norms. Because one of the difficulties in terms of unlocking how this ends is the notion of climbing down. And one of the things we say in the military that Trump's thing about unconditional surrender was not helpful, because the other military philosopher we talk about is Thucydides, where fear, honor, and interest always come into play. And the honor thing from a Persian perspective makes it very difficult for them to climb down at the moment. That is what I think they will do, but it will be difficult to do that at this precise moment. The key thing, though, I think, in terms of the future here, is that the cavalry came over the hill for the Israelis. Now, if we only have to go back to the 14th of June for Trump to have said that this was a unilateral Israeli strike and the Americans were not involved, here we are only 8 or 10 days later, and the Americans have come over the hill. What's significant is the cavalry have not come over the hill for the Iranians. The Russians are not going to join in, and the Chinese are not going to join in. So they're on their own, and that still means that there's a huge pressure strategy for the Iranians to eventually have to settle for some sort of agreement. And I think that agreement will be something like they may be allowed to keep a civil nuclear facility, but there'll be no enrichment allowed within Iran. So the cavalry have come over the hill. Now, that doesn't mean we're out of the woods yet. The first thing is, though, that although Trump has said that this was immensely successful, the Americans will be doing battle damage assessment to make sure that they have absolutely destroyed Fordow in particular. So what is the Iranian response that we're looking at? Well, again, in terms of Persian cultural norms, the first thing that they've done or will do is what they call strike and withhold. So in terms of striking Israel, which they've done since the 14th of June, the withhold bit has always been that there are US targets and Gulf cooperation countries' targets in the Gulf, which they could hit. And indeed, in 2020, when Soleimani was taken out by the Americans, he was the IRGC Quds Force commander, very prominent in the strangulation strategy of the Iranians on the Israelis. The Iranians launched 13 ballistic missiles against the Al-Assad base in Iraq. It could be that they do some sort of minimal strike on one or two bases, not a theater-wide strike, which would involve Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, all the American bases throughout the region. The worst case, I think, from the Allies' perspective, I mean America and everyone else, is that the Iranians go towards a posture of closing the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil runs through that. And as at today, the price of a barrel of oil, Brent crude, was $77. It'll be interesting because of the geopolitical realities rather than market realities, whether that goes up in the next few days. And indeed, that is exactly what happened, for example, after the 7th of October 2023, when oil went up to $90 a barrel. So it's come down significantly since that. Now, that is where the Brits may get involved, because one of the things about the British posture in the region under Op Kipian, it's been a long-standing British operation in the Persian Gulf and the wider Middle East, is that we have mine countermeasure vessels co-located with the American Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. And if the Iranians were to try and close the Strait of Hormuz, then those would be a definite ask by the Americans to the Brits. But again, there is a potential vulnerability here for the Iranians, and it's this, that when the Iranians in 1988 tried to mine parts of the Persian Gulf, almost sinking a US destroyer, that led to the largest American surface operation since the Second World War, Operation Praying Mantis. And again, you'd have something like that from the American perspective should the Iranians try to close the Strait of Hormuz. That again is a vulnerability for the Iranians. So in terms of their payoff matrix and how we look at international relations in terms of game theory, in terms of win-win, win-lose, lose-lose, lose-win, their options are pretty limited at the moment. They're limited to damage. They're not limited to a strategic denouement. The predominant exporting through that is not only the 2.1 million barrels of oil per day from the Iranians, but it's the significant oil and gas coming from Qatar, from KSA, Saudi Arabia. So it's the whether that gets stopped, which would be the potential problem. Now, this again is not like 1973 when the Israeli war against, the preemption by the other Arab states against the Israelis brought this into play in terms of the price of a barrel of oil, because the economic dependence, particularly for the Americans on Middle Eastern oil, has really gone away in the last 50 years. This strategically gives the Americans more freedom of action. And indeed, the OPEC plus countries probably gives them slightly more freedom of action than we had. And again, the strategic reserves on the Americans may ameliorate that for the future. So it isn't potentially this stranglehold for the future that it was 50 years ago. The stranglehold, if it comes, is more likely to be for those countries that tacitly always said they supported Iran. You know, the Iranian oil goes to China, it goes to India, places like that. They're the ones who would suffer, and they're the ones who therefore would want some sort of some peace deal at the end, because the key thing here is how do you get to conflict resolution? There's a difference between warfare, which is effectively what we've seen overnight, which is the servicing of targets, which the Americans and the Israelis can do very successfully, and war, the political outcome for which you should go use warfare means for. And that the one that you really want as the outcome from an Israeli perspective is that Iran signs up to some deal which they will not enrich uranium for the future. The Iranian bar, as I think I said to you 2 months ago, James, is very low. It is that regime survival is the number one priority, and domestic security is the number two priority. One of the outcomes of this, of course, would be if that isn't achieved in short order, then you do come into all these things about potential regime collapse in Iran. And although it might be tacitly said by the Israelis that that is an outcome that they want, that is always a difficult one to predict because you still have the Basij, the volunteer militia in Iran alongside the IRGC, who are quite capable of slaughtering large numbers of people because of their ideological drive behind those portions of the regime. They will, I think, be able to secure the cities quite well, but there are centrifugal forces in other parts, more rural parts of the country, where they might have difficulty in establishing the authority of the Islamic regime throughout the entirety of Iran. There are two things I think will happen. Firstly, the strike and withhold things means that there's a big decision to be taken by the Iranians about what targets they hit to satisfy their honor. And again, in Persian honor code, and they've signaled this to the Americans before, that retaliation should be deemed to be something that they should accept and be necessary. As long as that is of a sufficiently small size and that the Americans can deal with it. So, for example, when I quoted the al-Assad example from 2020 after Soleimani was hit, damaging infrastructure is okay, killing Americans is not. That will inevitably lead to a large-scale retaliation. So I think there will be some sort of retaliation. The second thing I think is there will be a renewed diplomatic push to try and close this off. And I do think, as I've said a number of times, that Iran, because of its bar being low about regime security and survival, will have to drink once more from the chalice of poison if they are going to maintain the Islamic regime, revolutionary regime, in its current form.